So here we come face to face. The sun will arrive at the Pleiades cluster in the constellation Taurus on May 21st, and we can see that nearness of the Redeemer coming to the churches. And usually when I start researching and writing on a blank page, which can be really daunting, I look for the anchors in the scriptures of the Lord's accounts which have prophetic meaning to our time, which are time-stamped. In addition to the celestial signs and the markers, I put them on the calendar, and I often use Torah calendar, therefore, understanding that there are certain limitations, so they don't keep into account a delayed new moon sighting, and sometimes I disagree with them because we have a different understanding of the scriptures. So when we spoke about the offering of the first fruits, which was on the first day after the Sabbath of Passover, it leads to a different Omer count. So if you go to the Omer count on Torah calendar itself, it's a different count than this one, but I believe this one to be correct. And the same goes for the ascension marker they place on May 17th. If you go to Acts 1-3, you read that the apostles of the Lord had seen the Lord resurrected for 40 days. So in between the resurrection and his ascension are 40 days. And we know that Mary was the first one who witnessed the Lord resurrected. She was commissioned to speak the gospel of the resurrected Christ to the other disciples. But at the beginning she was not believed, and it was not until the Lord met the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then later that day in the upper room, those who were gathered there, most likely from the early afternoon until the evening, they were startled when he suddenly appeared, transformed in their midst. And that's when he commissioned them and breathed the Spirit into them, and he gave them the authority to remit and retain people's sins. So the 40-day count would lead to today, counting from Mary's first meeting with the Lord. And if the upper room meeting was indeed an evening meeting, it would even go to tomorrow. So on the celestial clock, we have the moon at perihelion, meaning physically closest to the sun, and the coming together of the bridegroom and the lunar bride will be tomorrow, the Echad phase of the sun and moon, which is commonly understood as the astronomical new moon. So the dark phase of the moon at 1854 Jerusalem time. And that is also the day that Jupiter, the king planet, and man-child in Revelation 12:5 is exiting Pisces and entering the throne room. So we see another bookend of one season closing, the season of fishing, and the entry from the waters onto dry land. And remember the scene at the crowning of the entryway out of the nations onto the harvest field and then into the throne room. So the right ascension, the angle of Jupiter toward the spring equinox, will be exactly 153.55 on that day. So that is a celestial wink to fullness. There's another marker of closure on that day with the fast of Samuel, the commemoration of the death of the prophet Samuel, who anointed both Saul and David. So I think there is also a closure of a prophetic season, which is indicated on this day, as well as the closure of the second Passover season, because in the time of Hezekiah, when the second Passover was extended to those who were ritually unclean or afar off, the celebration of the feast after second Passover was extended with 1 week. So here we have the 7th day after second Passover, and this would be the 14th day of the second Passover time frame. So the closure of the atonement picture of second Passover is also tomorrow. And then, of course, the expected sighting of the new moon. It is not just a Rosh Chodesh, or the head of the new month, but in the time before the Exodus, the new moon of the month of Sivan was actually considered New Year. And that is going to tie in to the seasonal transition of the sun and the Pleiades as well. So the New Year marker before the Exodus is perhaps going to be coupled with the sighting of the new moon on or after the Sabbath, and that's not just a regular new moon. Torah calendar mentions it too. I just hadn't paid attention to it in previous years, but it's called Machar Chodesh, and that is when the new moon is expected on the day after the beginning of the Sabbath. So the new moon of Sivan is expected on 5/20, after the Sabbath has already started, Friday evening, 5/19, going to sunset on the next day. The special new moon is referred to as Machar Chodesh, meaning tomorrow is the new month or the new moon. The terminology comes from 1 Samuel 20, verses 18 to 42, which foreshadow the transition of power from Saul, the once anointed but now fallen king, to David, also anointed by Samuel, Israel's newly anointed king, before David's coronation and public presentation. David, the beloved, types the first fruits of Revelation 14:4, and he meets with Jonathan, the son of King Saul. His name means Yahweh has given. And they make a royal covenant before the new moon. David is going to be absent from that lunar banquet because they speak of the lunar banquet, and we know from that chapter that that lasted for 2 days because they were not certain up front whether or not the new moon would actually be sighted. And that will likely come into play this new moon as well. The reunion of the sun and moon, Sal Oman, is found in this chapter, 1 Samuel 20, but of course also embedded in the account of Ruth and the kinsman redeemer Boaz, who are betrothed on the threshing floor when the barley and the winter wheat harvests were ongoing. So the Pleiades cluster is also associated with the tribulum, and the cluster as a whole is also known as a heap. So we have a coming together of the sun, the moon, the bridegroom, and the groom. The moon being covered in the sun's rays, just like Ruth sought the covering in the spirit, but also his redemptive love by laying at his feet in the servant position at the threshing floor. So we have that picture in the heavens this week as well. The heap of stars of the Pleiades, known as a threshing floor. And of course, there are multiple references in Scripture of judgment starting at the new moon. We have the references to the basket of summer fruit. We have Joel 2. We have Amos 8, Hosea 5. So if you're so led, you can read these scriptures, and there will be stories like opening up underneath these references of judgment starting after a new moon with a basket of summer fruit. So we have a transition in the time before the Exodus from winter to summer, and this weekend with the sun visiting the Pleiades on May 21st, we have another hinge point in the ancient reckoning of timekeeping from winter to summer. We're going to see that later. But there's also a big but, as in the sliver is going to be so very small. It's only 0.7%. I saw at timedate.com. So the likelihood of the new moon actually being sighted is very, very slim. So if it is sighted, Sivan will start after IR 29. And if the new moon is not sighted, it will by default start one day later. So you can go to renewedmoon.com to track the sighting of the new moon. I will also make mention of it in the community post, what will happen if it is sighted or not. And there are other sites who are also keeping account of the sighting of the new moon in Jerusalem by the Levitical standards. But because it's only 0.7%, the likelihood of it not being sighted is relatively high. So every year, the elite timestamped this particular transition from Ayar to Sivan with their G7 meetings. This year it's going to be in Hiroshima, Japan, and they have stamped that really big with their new dawn, the sun rising in the east, but also with the prospect of nuclear warfare. So that is something to be mindful of. And depending on the sighting of the new moon, I have two calendars in the article. This is the calendar for the first week of Sivan with the regular markers and the celestial markers and the scriptural markers below. If it were to be that the new moon is not sighted, I have another calendar included where the markers in the scripture are corrected. So Sivan could start on the day of the sunset of May 21st. So everything moves forward one day. And you can look at this calendar for what I believe to be the accurate placement of all the events. So of course, the celestial events won't move because the heavenly clock is not subject to the delayed new moon sighting, but the scriptural markers do move forward one day. So let us go back to what is expected to happen with the onset of the third month. The celestial markers are found on top, the scriptural markers underneath the day count, and I believe the key marker for May 20th and May 21st are the coming together of the sun and moon first, and then the sun conjoining the Pleiades, May 21st. We find that reference in scripture in the account of what I mentioned, David and Jonathan prior to the new moon. Then David being absent from that banquet, the account of Ruth and Boaz, but also, of course, Revelation 1-4, John meeting the Lord resurrected in the throne room, standing amidst the 7 candlesticks. And the Pleiades is the representation of those 7 churches. Amos 5:8 also refers to that scene and the Pleiades. It was the ancient celestial start of spring, the closing of the door of winter, the opening of the door of summer. In the ancient rendition from the enemy perspective, it was the marker for the Celtic Beltane as well as May Day. So we are now being given the understanding that that is tied to May 1st, but celestially it was tied to the sun meeting the Pleiades. And I think the elite are very much aware of the celestial marker for these 2 high ritual days in their book. We have 3 angelic messengers or trumpets, the comets E3, K2, and S3 in the constellation Lepus, now depicted as a hare but originally a snake, underneath the foot of Orion. The enemy he will tread underfoot. So the Lord is once again marking out that he's going to come forth not just as light, but also in judgment, trampling his and our enemy under his feet. The evening star, Venus, the beloved, the David bride type, is positioned in the constellation Gemini, the 2 towers, the bride and the bridegroom. And in the ancient renditions of the Mayan civilization, we have an alignment over the pyramid of Teotihuacan, and that is going to be on display in the celestial overview as well. So in the next video, let us take a look at the heavens, at what this actually looks like this weekend.